In response to widespread litigation and the demand for justice and healing from survivors of the Indian residential school system, a network of boarding schools intended for indigenous peoples that took them away from the influence of their own culture and forced them to adapt to the dominant Canadian culture, Canada established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, TRC, in 2008. Residential schools had existed in Canada for over 160 years, with approximately 150,000 Indigenous students. It evolved into an aggressive assimilation and colonization strategy of Indigenous peoples, forcing them to abandon their own culture and tradition. The federal government saw the residential school system as a means of converting Indigenous peoples and poor children into Catholics and Protestants to work for them. It also allowed the colonial power to claim the ancestral lands of Indigenous communities, especially since Canada was still in the process of reformation at the time. Following this, children from the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Indigenous groups were forcibly separated from their families and communities and placed in residential schools. These schools were established in almost every province and area of the country, with the exception of Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland, and New Brunswick, and were funded by the federal government and administered by Christian churches. The Indian residential school system in Canada had been in operation since 1883, but its origins can be traced back to the 1830s. Before Confederation in 1867, the Anglican Church established a residential school in Brantford, Ontario. Furthermore, churches had begun to establish schools, particularly for Indigenous peoples, since the mid-1600s. The schools were mostly built in eastern Canada at the time, but due to colonization, they were eventually relocated west. Initially, the residential school system's primary subjects were industrial labor schools and agricultural schools. In the early 1900s, Canada had 22 industrial schools and 39 residential schools. By 1931, the country had 80 schools in operation. Although the majority of them were residential schools, they also maintained industrial work through gardens, barns, factories, and sewing rooms. Saskatchewan's last residential school closed in 1996. Other countries, including Ireland, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and Sweden, used residential schools to colonize Indigenous peoples. Survivors of the residential school system have been coming forward since the 1960s. Indeed, between the late 1980s and the 1990s, Indigenous groups began to file legal actions against the federal government and Christian churches for the harm caused by residential schools, but it took several decades for Canada to recognize and accept these stories as true. Following the Canadian government's response to the Royal Commission's report on Aboriginal peoples in 1998, official reconciliation talks began. A section about the Indian residential school system and a statement of reconciliation were included in the response. The Aboriginal Healing Foundation, AHF, was established the same year. The foundation received a $350 million grant to be used for community-based healing services for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit survivors of residential schools. Over 100 church bodies, the federal government, lawyers representing survivors, the Assembly of First Nations, and the Inuit Tapert Kanatami signed the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement in 2006. The Aboriginal Healing Foundation received an additional $125 million as part of the settlement agreement in 2007. The Canadian government, however, did not renew funding for the AHF in 2014. A year later, the foundation was closed. Following the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement Compensation Package, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission (TRC) of Canada was formally established on June 1, 2008. The Commission's goal was to document the history and experiences of Indigenous peoples affected and harmed by the Indian residential school system. On June 11, 2008, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper issued a public apology to survivors of residential schools. Representatives from the Liberal Party, the New Democratic Party, and the Bloc Québécois also delivered formal apologies, acknowledging the long-term effects of residential schools on Indigenous communities. The apology was witnessed by survivors and representatives from Indigenous groups from across the country in the House of Commons. In addition, in June 2015, the TRC released an executive summary of its findings, which included the 94 calls to action for reconciliation between Canadians and Indigenous peoples. These calls served as guidelines for the country's organizations and ministries to assist Indigenous peoples in areas such as child welfare, education, culture, language, health, and justice. The Commission's work concluded in December 2015 with the release of a multi-volume final report concluding that the Indian residential education system amounted to cultural genocide. As a result of the reconciliation process, educational institutions, particularly elementary and secondary schools, implemented significant changes and incorporated the history of the residential school system into their curricula.